Hey guys, welcome back to TechCravers. Now, I've tested a lot of retro handhelds over the years. Small ones, big ones, cheap ones, ridiculously powerful ones, and of course, more 4x3 handhelds than I can probably remember. But every once in a while, a device comes along where everything just seems to fall into place. And this is one of those devices. This is the brand new Retroid Pocket Nova, and after spending quite a bit of time with it, I think I can say something that I don't say very often. This is the best 4x3 handheld I have ever used. And it's not just because it's powerful, it's a combination. You get this absolutely gorgeous 4x5 inch AMOLED display, a proper 4x3 aspect ratio, 120Hz, enough performance to comfortably push into systems like GameCube and PlayStation 2, all packed into a handheld that feels surprisingly compact. And when you start playing those classic 4x3 systems on this screen, yeah, it just makes sense. No huge black bars, no oversized handheld built around a widescreen display that you really don't need, just a beautiful screen filled with the games it was basically made for. Now, the Nova isn't perfect and there are definitely a few things we need to talk about, but as a complete package, I think Retroid might just have created the new king of 4x3 handhelds. So let's find out why. Alright, let's quickly get the specs out of the way, because there's actually quite a lot packed into this little thing. At the heart of the Pocket Nova, we have the Qualcomm's QCS8550 paired with an Adreno 740 GPU. Now, if that name means absolutely nothing to you, don't worry. It's essentially the non-cellular version of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, the same generation of flagship silicon that powered phones like the Galaxy S23 series. So we're talking about some serious horsepower for a handheld this size. You can get the Nova with either 8 or 12GB of LPDDR5X RAM, while both versions come with 128GB of UFS 3.1 storage, plus a microSD card slot for expansion. Up front we have arguably the star of the show, a 4.5-inch 4x3 AMOLED touchscreen running at 1280x960 and, rather ridiculously for a retro handheld, 120Hz. There's also a 5000 mAh battery, active cooling, Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.3, analog triggers and 3D Hall effect joysticks. Charging go up to 27 watts and we also get video output over USB-C. And the whole thing runs on Android 13 out of the box, which is definitely getting a little old at this point, although interestingly the Nova already has official Lineage OS support if you want something newer. So yeah, on paper this thing is basically flagship Android handheld hardware squeezed into a compact 4x3 body. But specs only tell half of the story, because the first thing you're actually going to notice when you pick up the Nova is the hardware itself. So alright, moving on to the actual hardware, and starting in the front we have these fully RGB customizable analog sticks. You can change the lighting to pretty much whatever you want or just turn it off completely if RGB isn't your thing. The sticks themselves feels really good though, they're smooth, they have a nice amount of travel and the caps are actually removable as well. Moving over we have the A, B, X and Y face buttons. They're relatively small but I actually really like the way they feel. There's a decent amount of travel when you press them and with a subtle click at the bottom so they feel responsive without being overly loud or harsh. And moving further up we have L1 and R1 together with proper analog L2 and R2 triggers. The shoulder buttons are noticeably more clicky, while the analog triggers have a surprisingly good amount of travel for such a small handheld. But before we continue around the device, I want to stop here for a second and talk about the back, because this is important. Everyone who picked up the Retroid Pocket Nova during the pre-sale period also received this optional replacement backplate. And as you can see, I've already swapped mine. And I'm not going to lie, the Pocket Nova in its original configuration is significantly worse when it comes to ergonomics, especially during longer gaming sessions. The original back is almost completely flat, whereas this replacement gives you these much more pronounced curves for your fingers to wrap around. And pretty much the moment I installed it, I knew I was never going back. It completely changes how the Nova sits in my hands. The installation itself was fairly easy and Retroid includes the tools you need to do it. Anyway, continuing our tour and moving up on the top we have the two additional M1 and M2 buttons. These can be mapped to pretty much whatever you want, which makes them useful for things like emulator shortcuts or whatever makes sense for your setup. We also have a power button, volume controls and a fairly substantial exhaust for the active cooling system. And then we have the D-pad, and this thing is clicky like really clicky. Personally though, I really like the way it feels. It's quite light, very responsive, and has almost PS Vita style clickiness to it. Retroid has also placed the D-pad above the analog stick on the Nova, which I think makes perfect sense considering the systems you're most likely going to play on a 4x3 handheld like this. But if you're someone who prefers having an analog stick on the top, that's definitely something you should know before buying one. We also have two front-facing speakers giving us proper stereo sound, and I have to say they sound pretty good. And finally, along the bottom we have a micro SD card slot for expanding the storage, a 3.5mm headphone jack, which I'm always happy to see, and of course our USB-C port for charging as well as video output. And before we get into performance, I just want to quickly mention that I bought this Pocket Nova with my own money, and as usual when it comes to Retroid, I wasn't sent a review unit or anything like that. I paid $234 for my crystal model with 8GB of RAM, and with DHL shipping that brought the total to $269. If I were to order the exact same configuration today, it would cost me $279 including shipping. So honestly, ordering during the pre-sale didn't save me a huge amount of money. The bigger bonus was really that replacement backplate we talked about earlier, which was included for pre-sale customers. If you go for the 12GB version instead, that currently costs $274 or $299 including shipping in my case. And personally, I wouldn't spend the extra money on 12GB of RAM. With this form factor and 4x3 display, I really don't see myself using the Nova for PC games or other RAM heavy stuff where those extra 4GB might actually make meaningful difference. For the kind of emulation this thing is designed for, 8GB is more than enough. Oh, and if you don't want one of the transparent colors, the regular non-transparent models are $5 cheaper across the board. So with pricing out of the way, let's see what that Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 class hardware can actually do. And let's start with the classics. Systems like Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis are of course absolutely buttery smooth on the Pocket Nova. But with the amount of power inside this thing, we weren't exactly expecting anything else. What is interesting here is just how ridiculously good these older games look. This is where that 4x3 AMOLED display really starts to show why it's such a big deal. The colors just pop in a way that I'm honestly not sure I've seen before on a handheld this size. Bright, colorful games like this looks absolutely fantastic. The blacks are properly black and everything just has this richness and contrast that makes these old games look almost new again. And then, of course, you have the 4x3 aspect ratio. These systems are basically what this display was made for. So instead of playing them on some big widescreen panel with huge black bars on either side, the game gets to completely dominate the front of the handheld. And that, more than raw performance, is what makes playing these older systems on the Nova feel so special. You obviously don't need anything remotely this powerful to emulate a Super Nintendo or Genesis, but give those games the right aspect ratio, perfect OLED blacks and these incredibly punchy colors, and suddenly there's a pretty compelling reason to play them here anyway. But let's move forward a generation, starting with the Nintendo 64. And moving up to Nintendo 64, this is where we finally start making use of that analog stick. And I have to say it feels really good for games like Mario 64. It's smooth, precise and has enough range that controlling Mario never feels overly sensitive or twitchy. Performance-wise, we're still nowhere near challenging the Nova, of course. We can comfortably increase the internal resolution, clean up classic N64 image considerably, and still maintain perfectly smooth performance. The Nintendo DS, as you probably know, also has two 4x3 displays, which means that platform is going to work brilliantly on the Nova, as long as you don't mind swapping between the two screens while you're playing. Things get a little less ideal when we move over to systems like the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo 3DS. The GBA uses a 3x2 aspect ratio, while the top screen on the 3DS is 5x3, so neither of them is really a perfect match for the Nova's 4x3 display. There's obviously more than enough power here to run them, and 3DS emulation in particular runs really well, but you'll either have to live with some black bars or a stretch image, and personally I'd take the black bars every time. And if we go even further back to the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color, those use a much squarer 10:9 aspect ratio, which means, yeah, even bigger, chunkier bars on the sides. Oh no, so I can't enjoy first gen Pokemon on my King of 4x3? Well, I'm glad you asked, because Gen1Recomp together with the voxel mod works absolutely beautiful on the Nova and turns those original Pokemon games into an absolutely joy to play on this thing. And just look at it. I've already made a full guide showing you how to install and set everything up, so just make sure to check out that later if you haven't seen it already. But alright, we've spent enough time on systems that barely make the Nova break a sweat, so let's move on to GameCube and PlayStation 2 and finally give that chipset something a little more challenging to do. And this right here is where the Retroid Pocket Nova becomes a 10 out of 10 handheld for me. Think about what we have here. A 4:3 aspect ratio, an absolutely stunning AMOLED display, proper analog controls, analog triggers, and enough performance to comfortably play pretty much your entire GameCube and PlayStation 2 library without having to spend half your evening tweaking emulator settings. You can basically just pick up a game and start playing. Actually, that's a lie. You are going to want to tweak one setting. Because with this much performance available, there's absolutely no reason to play these games at their original resolution. Crank the internal resolution up 3 or 4 times native depending on the game and suddenly these 20-plus-year-old games looks absolutely incredible. And there's something almost magical about seeing them like this. Play something like The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker or God of War 2 and they almost look the way you remember them looking rather than the way they were actually looking back then. Everything is cleaner and sharper, the colors absolutely explode on the AMOLED panel, but the games themselves still have exactly the same art style and character that you remember. And because so many games from this generation were designed specifically around 4:3 displays, they fill this screen beautifully. No stretching, no ridiculous black bars, no wasted display. Just these classic games rendered at several times their original resolution on a gorgeous AMOLED panel that fits them almost perfectly. And that's the Pocket Nova's sweet spot for me. GameCube and PlayStation 2 aren't just systems that it can emulate, they're systems that make me understand why this handheld exists. Now, should you ever feel like the Pocket Nova screen is a little too 4:3, you can of course do what I'm doing here and use that USB-C video output to connect it to this video's sponsor, Uperfect. This is their GR14BU, a 14-inch portable monitor with a gorgeous 3K OLED display running at 120Hz with an ultra-low response time. So you're getting a much larger, incredibly sharp OLED image with those perfect blacks, punchy colors and super smooth motion, all in a display that's still thin and portable enough to easily throw in a bag. And since the Nova supports video output over USB-C, it's a really nice way of turning this tiny handheld into something that feels a lot closer to a proper console setup. I'll leave a link to the Uperfect GR14BU down below and a big thanks to Uperfect for sponsoring this video. But now let's go in completely the opposite direction, because the next game I want to show you doesn't need a bigger or wider display. In fact, Dusklight might just be the best thing I've ever played on a 4:3 handheld. And if you're wondering what Dusklight actually is, it's a tool that takes your own original GameCube ISO dump of The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess and turns it into a native Android port. And the easiest way I can describe the end result is this. Imagine something along the lines of Twilight Princess HD on the Wii U, except running natively on your Android handheld. You get a much cleaner, high-resolution presentation, a bunch of graphical improvements and customization options, and you're no longer locked to the original game's 30 FPS cap. And on the Pocket Nova, it's absolutely glorious. You can run Twilight Princess at an uncapped frame rate and everything feels incredibly smooth and responsive, while still filling that beautiful 4:3 AMOLED display. Honestly, of everything I've tested on the Nova so far, this might be my favorite way of using it. And I'm not even exaggerating when I say that one of the hardest parts about making this review has actually been putting the Pocket Nova down long enough to work on this video. Every time I start capturing some Twilight Princess footage, somehow 5 minutes of B-roll turns into another hour of playing. And I think that probably says more about how much I'm enjoying this thing than any benchmark ever could. But with that, I think it's time to wrap up this review, and honestly I don't think my conclusion is going to surprise anyone who's made it this far. The Retroid Pocket Nova is the best 4:3 handheld I've ever used. It's obviously not perfect, the original flat backplate isn't particularly comfortable for longer sessions, the D-pad is very clicky and won't be for everyone, and that 4:3 display that makes the Nova so special also means it's not necessarily the handheld I'd choose for widescreen systems, Game Boy Advance or more modern Android games. And of course, Android 13 is also starting to feel pretty old in 2026. But those are relatively small complaints when you look at what the Nova gets right. The performance is fantastic, the controls feel great, you got analog triggers, excellent joysticks, expandable storage, active cooling, video output, and enough horsepower that GameCube and PlayStation 2 emulation becomes almost effortless. But more than anything, it's that screen. The 4.5-inch AMOLED display completely transforms this device. For older 4x3 systems, it's beautiful. For GameCube and PlayStation 2, it's damn near perfect. And then you throw something like Dusklight and Twilight Princess at it, and you end up with an experience that's genuinely difficult to put down. There are handhelds with bigger screens, there are handhelds with wider screens, and there are handhelds with even more performance. But if what you want is a compact handheld specifically built around the games of the 4x3 era, for me, right now, this is the king of 4x3. And with that guys, I want to know what you think. Is the Pocket Nova the new 4x3 king, or is there another handheld you'd choose instead? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to TechCravers for more handheld reviews, guides and all things tech, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.